Black boy helps millionaire with flat tire. The next day, a black SUV showed up at his house. A black Mercedes-Benz SUV crawled through the merciless winter storm, its headlights barely penetrating the thick curtain of snow. Inside, David Maxwell's knuckles whitened against the leather steering wheel. The digital display showed 5 def, but the real chill came from the emptiness that had haunted him for years. The sudden bang was deafening. The car lurched, sliding on the ice before coming to a stop. In the bitter cold, David stood staring at the flat tire, his expensive wool coat offering little comfort. His phone showed no signal. Through the swirling snow, he caught sight of a small figure approaching a black teenager no more than 14, wearing a threadbare jacket. "Need help, sir," the boy called out, his breath visible in the freezing air. David hesitated. In his world of corporate law and million-dollar deals, trust was a commodity rarely given freely. Yet something in the boy's eyes, a warmth that defied the bitter cold, made him pause. Little did David know that this moment, on this desolate winter road, would unravel a web of guilt, redemption, and a decades-old injustice that would change both their lives forever. Before we dive into this touching story of kindness and redemption, take a moment to share where you're watching from and hit that like button. Your engagement means the world to us. David Maxwell hadn't always been the cold man he'd become. At 52, he was one of Boston's most feared corporate lawyers, known for his ruthless efficiency in the courtroom and an uncanny ability to spot weakness. His corner office on the 47th floor of Maxwell Associates overlooked the city he'd helped shape through countless mergers, acquisitions, and though he rarely admitted it, more than a few morally questionable verdicts. The photograph on his mahogany desk showed a younger David with his wife Elizabeth, who'd left 3 years ago. "You've become a stranger," she'd said, "someone who measures everything by its dollar value." The divorce papers arrived a week later. Their daughter Amanda was away at Yale, calling only on holidays with brief, formal conversations that felt more like business meetings than family chats. His morning routine was a testament to his calculated existence: Italian suits hand-pressed each morning, breakfast meetings at the Bristol, and a driver waiting with his Mercedes every day at exactly 7:15 a.m. Today was different only because he'd insisted on driving himself, a decision he now regretted as the storm worsened. 20 years earlier, David had made his name prosecuting corporate fraud cases. His reputation for being thorough and uncompromising caught the attention of powerful people. One case in particular had launched his career: the conviction of a small-time accountant named Michael Thompson for alleged embezzlement. The evidence had seemed solid at the time, or perhaps David hadn't looked closely enough, too eager to prove himself. The memory sometimes surfaced in his quieter moments like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. The firm's Christmas party last week had been another reminder of his isolation. Standing among colleagues who laughed too loudly at his jokes and junior partners who vied for his attention, David had felt the hollowness of his success. The young intern's words, overheard by accident, had cut deeper than he cared to admit. "Mr. Maxwell? Yeah, he's brilliant, but I heard he'd throw his own mother under the bus for a win." His recent insomnia had led to late-night drives through the city's poorer neighborhoods, where he found himself wondering about the lives behind the darkened windows. It was during one of these drives that he'd first noticed the disparity between his world and theirs: the broken streetlights, the boarded-up shops, the children's playground equipment rusting in empty lots. Now, stuck on this deserted road in the worst storm of the year, David Maxwell was about to confront something he'd spent years avoiding: his own humanity. The boy approaching through the snow would be more than just a good Samaritan. He would be the key to unlocking a past David had carefully buried, and a future he never imagined possible. Lucas Thompson walked the 3 miles to school each morning, his father's worn leather jacket providing little warmth against the Boston winter. At 14, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed beyond his years, inherited from a father he barely remembered. His dark eyes held both wisdom and pain, the kind that comes from growing up too fast in a world that wasn't always kind. Home was a small, two-bedroom house on Cedar Street, where the paint peeled and the roof leaked, but where love filled every corner. Sarah Thompson, his mother, worked double shifts at Memorial Hospital as a nurse's aide, her gentle hands tending to others while her own world had been shattered 8 years ago. She kept a single photograph of her husband, Michael, on the nightstand, his warm smile frozen in time, taken just days before everything fell apart. The neighborhood kids called Lucas the helper because he was always there fixing old Mrs. Watson's fence, helping Mr. Rodriguez with his groceries, or tutoring younger children in math. He did it all with the same quiet determination his father had shown in life. "You don't help people for reward," Michael had told him, words that echoed in Lucas's mind years after his father's voice had gone silent. Sarah kept Michael's last letter taped inside her Bible, the pages worn from countless readings. The prison system had claimed natural causes, but the bruises on his body told a different story. He had died maintaining his innocence, refusing to plead guilty even when it might have meant a shorter sentence. The truth of his alleged embezzlement had died with him, or so they thought. Their small living room held a bookshelf filled with law books, Michael's old collection. Lucas would often sit there late at night reading by lamplight, trying to understand the system that had taken his father away. Sarah would watch him, her heart breaking at how much he looked like Michael, especially when he furrowed his brow in concentration. The Thompson house had become a gathering place for neighborhood children whose parents worked late. Sarah always managed to stretch their modest meals to feed an extra mouth or two, saying that kindness multiplies like loaves and fishes. The empty chair at their dinner table remained a silent reminder of the man who should have been there. Despite their struggles, Lucas excelled in school, earning straight A's and dreaming of becoming a lawyer not for the money or prestige, but to help people who, like his father, found themselves caught in a system that didn't always serve justice. His teachers spoke of scholarship possibilities, but college seemed a distant dream given their financial reality. On this bitter winter night, as Lucas walked home from his part-time job at the local grocery store, he spotted the stranded Mercedes. Something in him, that same spirit that had driven his father to help others, made him change direction, heading toward the stranger in need, unaware that this simple act of kindness would begin to unravel a decade-old injustice. The wind howled across the empty road as Lucas approached the stranded Mercedes, snow crunching beneath his worn boots. Through the swirling white, he could make out the silhouette of a man in an expensive coat, looking helplessly at the flat tire. The scene reminded him of his father's words, "Sometimes the richest people are the poorest in spirit." "Need help, Sir?" Lucas called out, his voice carrying through the bitter cold. David Maxwell turned, startled. His first instinct was caution. Years of city living had taught him to be wary of strangers, especially in deserted areas. But something in the boy's direct gaze made him pause. The teenager's jacket was threadbare, yet he stood tall, shoulders squared against the biting wind. "I've got a flat," David stated unnecessarily, gesturing at the obvious. "No cell service out here." Lucas moved closer, examining the tire with practiced eyes. "My dad taught me how to change these." "Got a spare?" His voice held no hint of judgment at David's obvious inexperience with such matters. David watched, bewildered, as Lucas confidently located the spare tire and jack in the SUV's trunk. The boy's hands, red from the cold, moved with surprising efficiency. Snow collected on his dark hair, but he seemed unbothered by the harsh conditions. "You shouldn't be out in this weather," David found himself saying, uncomfortable with watching someone so young work in such conditions. "It's dangerous." Lucas glanced up, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Someone has to help, sir. World's cold enough without people turning their backs on each other." The wisdom in his words struck David, reminding him of something long forgotten. As Lucas worked, David noticed details that pricked at his conscience. The boy's shoes were split at the seams, his jacket had been patched multiple times, and his hands bore the calluses of someone far too young to have worked so hard. "Let me pay you for your trouble," David said, reaching for his wallet once the tire was changed. He pulled out several $100 bills, but Lucas stepped back, shaking his head. "No need, sir. Dad always said helping others is payment enough." There was pride in his voice, untainted by bitterness. "At least tell me your name," David insisted, struggling to understand this unexpected kindness. "Lucas Thompson, sir. I live over on Cedar Street with my mom." The boy pointed vaguely toward the poorer side of town. "You should be good to drive now, but take it slow. These roads get treacherous." The name Thompson triggered something in David's memory, but the connection remained just out of reach. He watched as Lucas turned to leave, his slight frame leaning into the wind. "Wait," David called out. "Let me give you a ride home. It's the least I can do." Lucas shook his head again, that same gentle smile on his face. "Thanks, but I like walking. Gives me time to think." He raised a hand in farewell and continued down the road, eventually disappearing into the swirling snow. David sat in his warm car, engine idling, struck by an unfamiliar feeling. In his world of corporate law and high-stakes negotiations, kindness always came with strings attached. Yet here was this boy who had nothing to gain, helping a stranger in a storm. The heat slowly returned feeling to his fingers, but the warmth couldn't reach the cold spot in his chest, a void he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. Lucas's words echoed in his mind, "World's cold enough without people turning their backs on each other." When was the last time he'd helped someone without expecting something in return? When had he stopped seeing people as human beings and started seeing them as either assets or liabilities? The questions unsettled him like snow disturbed by a sudden wind. As he carefully drove away, David caught a glimpse of Lucas in his rearview mirror, a solitary figure trudging through the storm. The name Thompson kept nagging at him, like a case file he should remember but couldn't quite place. The boy's simple act of kindness had cracked something open in David's carefully constructed world. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of who he'd become, a man his younger self wouldn't recognize, let alone respect. That night, sleep eluded David Maxwell. He paced his penthouse apartment, bourbon untouched on his desk, the city lights twinkling below like distant stars. Lucas Thompson. The name wouldn't leave him alone, scratching at a locked door in his memory. He found himself opening his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. A simple search would satisfy his curiosity, yet something held him back. Was it fear? Or perhaps guilt over investigating someone who'd shown him nothing but kindness? Thompson. Cedar Street, David muttered, finally typing the address into his firm's private database. The screen flickered and suddenly he was staring at a case file from 8 years ago. His hand trembled as he clicked it open. State vs. Michael Thompson. The room seemed to grow colder. Images flashed across his screen, a small-time accountant accused of embezzling from a local charity, circumstantial evidence that had seemed so solid at the time, a conviction that had launched David's career into the stratosphere. "Oh God," he whispered, recognition hitting him like a physical blow. That boy in the storm, he was Michael Thompson's son. Memories flooded back the defendant's unwavering claims of innocence, his wife's tears in the courtroom, and a small boy clutching his father's jacket as the guilty verdict was read. David had dismissed their pain as just another day in court, another stepping stone to success. The news article at the bottom of the file delivered the final blow. Inmate Michael Thompson found dead in prison cell, natural causes cited. The date was 3 years after the conviction. David's legs gave way and he sank into his chair. The boy who had helped him without hesitation was the same child he'd helped orphan through his blind ambition. The irony was almost too much to bear. Sleep was impossible now. David spent the rest of the night reviewing the old case files, seeing details he'd overlooked or ignored in his rush to secure a conviction. Discrepancies in the financial records, witness statements that didn't quite align, and most damning of all, evidence of possible tampering that he'd chosen not to investigate. As dawn broke over Boston, David stood at his window, watch marking 6 a.m. The storm had passed, leaving the city blanketed in pristine white. But his world had shifted on its axis, colored by the weight of his past actions. His phone buzzed a message from the firm about an upcoming merger worth millions. Once that would have been his sole focus. Now it seemed hollow, meaningless against the debt he owed to a boy who showed him kindness despite everything. David made his decision as the first rays of sun touched the snow-covered streets. He couldn't undo the past, but perhaps he could begin to make amends. He would find a way to help Lucas and his mother, not out of guilt alone, but because their simple act of kindness had awakened something long dormant in his soul. He picked up his phone, dialing his assistant. "Cancel my meetings for the week," he said, voice firm, "and get me everything you can find on property values on Cedar Street." "Yes, now." As he hung up, David caught his reflection in the window, a successful man by society standards, but one who had lost his way. Lucas's words from the night before echoed in his mind. Dad always said helping others is payment enough. The boy had given him more than assistance. With a flat tire, he'd provided a chance at redemption. Whether he deserved that chance was another question entirely. David straightened his tie, habit born of years in courtrooms. Today he would begin to right an old wrong, knowing full well that the truth, if it ever came out, could destroy everything he'd built. But for the first time in years, he felt something like purpose stirring in his chest. The question wasn't whether to help anymore, but how to do it without revealing the devastating connection between them. Because if Lucas and his mother ever discovered who he really was, Lucas deserves a like for his kindness in helping a stranger during that bitter winter storm, yet sadly no one has given him one yet. Will you be the first? Early morning light cast long shadows on Cedar Street as David parked his Mercedes a block away from the Thompson house. The neighborhood was a stark contrast to his usual surroundings: broken sidewalks, abandoned storefronts, and houses desperately in need of repair. The Thompson residence stood out, not for its disrepair, but for the small signs of care: a swept walkway, modest flower boxes despite the winter, and carefully patched windows. An ancient station wagon sat in the driveway, its exhaust leaving clouds in the frigid air as Sarah Thompson prepared to leave for her morning shift. David watched from his car as Lucas emerged, wearing the same threadbare jacket from the night before. The boy hugged his mother goodbye, then began his long walk to school. The scene struck David with unexpected force, such simple love, yet more genuine than anything in his world of corporate dealings. He waited until both were gone before approaching the house, ostensibly as a potential investor in neighborhood properties. The real estate agent he'd hastily hired, Ellen Porter, met him at the corner. "Mr. Maxwell, with all due respect," Ellen whispered as they walked, "this area's hardly worth your time. These properties." "Show me everything," David interrupted. "Especially the Thompson house." As they walked the neighborhood, David learned the stories Ellen had gathered. Sarah Thompson worked double shifts at the hospital, somehow managing to keep her son in school despite their circumstances. They were behind on their mortgage, the house was in desperate need of repairs, and the bank was considering foreclosure. The previous owner, Ellen continued, checking her notes, Michael Thompson, he was involved in some scandal. Skip that part, David cut in sharply, his chest tightening. Inside the Thompson house, the poverty was evident, but so was the dignity with which they faced it. Books lined makeshift shelves, many of them law texts. A framed photo caught David's eye: Michael Thompson in his graduation gown, holding a young Lucas, his wife beaming beside them. The same photo had been Exhibit C in the trial, used to show what the defendant stood to lose. The kitchen told its own story: carefully mended curtains, a table with mismatched chairs, and a collection of payment notices partially hidden beneath a fruit bowl. But there was also a vase of fresh flowers, homework spread across the table, and a wall calendar marked with Lucas's academic achievements. The roof shot, Ellen noted professionally. Heating's barely functional. They're using space heaters, which is dangerous. David stood in Lucas's room, absorbing every detail. A bed with a carefully patched quilt. A desk made from salvaged wood. And there, hanging on a nail, was Michael Thompson's old leather briefcase, the same one he'd carried during the trial. Something inside David broke. "Get me the property records," he ordered Ellen. "Mortgage details, liens, everything, and I want structural reports on the entire house." "Mr. Maxwell, are you actually considering?" And Ellen, he turned, his voice leaving no room for argument. Complete discretion. Not a word to anyone, especially the Thompsons. After Ellen left, David remained, standing in the small living room. A school essay lay on the coffee table, titled "My Hero, My Father," in Lucas's careful handwriting. Unable to help himself, David began to read. "My father taught me that true wealth isn't in your wallet, but in how you treat others. He helped people with their taxes for free, gave meals to those who were hungry, and never asked for anything in return. Some say he was a criminal, but I know the truth. He was the most honest man I've ever known. Every time I help someone, I feel him smiling. Every act of kindness is a way to keep him alive." David set the paper down, his hands shaking. Through the window, he could see children walking home from school, their laughter carrying on the cold air. Soon Lucas would return, unaware that the man he'd helped last night was standing in his living room, drowning in guilt. The sound of a door closing startled him. Sarah Thompson stood in the doorway, still in her hospital scrubs, staring at the stranger in her house. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice tired but firm. "What are you doing in my home?" David turned, and for a moment he saw her as she'd been 8 years ago, standing in that courtroom. Her face had more lines now, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes held the same strength. Before he could answer, Lucas appeared behind her, his expression changing from confusion to recognition. "Hey, it's the man from last night," Lucas said, smiling. "The one with the flat tire." Sarah's posture relaxed slightly, but her eyes remained wary. "Why are you here?" David Maxwell, who had faced down corporate giants without flinching, found himself speechless for the first time in years. The silence in the Thompson living room hung heavy as winter frost. David felt the weight of Sarah's gaze, saw the gentle trust in Lucas's eyes, and for a moment wished he could disappear into the worn floorboards beneath his feet. "I wanted to thank your son properly," he managed, the half-truth bitter on his tongue. "The help last night, it meant more than he knows." Sarah's expression softened slightly, a mother's pride warming her tired features. "Lucas takes after his father that way," she said, then caught herself, pain flickering across her face at the memory. "Please sit," Lucas offered, gesturing to their modest couch. "Mom makes the best coffee in Boston, even if it's not fancy like those downtown places." As Sarah went to the kitchen, David noticed her slight limp, a detail from the old case file surfaced. She'd been injured in a car accident rushing to the courthouse the day of the verdict. Another consequence of his actions he'd never considered. Lucas chatted easily about school, his part-time job, his dreams of becoming a lawyer. Each word was a knife twisting in David's gut. The boy's backpack lay open, a law book visible inside one of his father's old texts. Sarah returned with coffee in mismatched mugs. Her hands trembled slightly as she set them down, and David noticed the worn wedding ring she still wore. "Mister," she prompted. "Maxwell," he replied automatically, then froze as he saw recognition flash in her eyes. The mug in Sarah's hands clattered against the table. Coffee spilled dark against the worn wood, but no one moved to clean it. "Maxwell," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "David Maxwell." Lucas looked between them, confused. "Mom." But Sarah was already backing away, her face drained of color. "You were the prosecutor," she said, "the one who she couldn't finish." David stood, his own coffee untouched. "Mrs. Thompson, please." "Get out," her voice shook with 8 years of contained grief and rage. "How dare you come here? How dare you sit here and drink coffee with my son after what you did to his father?" Lucas's confusion turned to understanding, then disbelief. "You're the one who sent Dad to prison." The boy's question hit harder than any courtroom argument David had ever faced. The pure betrayal in those young eyes that just hours ago had shown nothing but kindness was unbearable. "I didn't know last night," Lucas continued, his voice breaking. "When I helped you, I didn't know you were the one who he stopped," looking at his father's briefcase hanging on the wall. Lucas, David started, but what could he say? That he was sorry? That he'd been wrong? That every kindness the boy had shown him was more than he deserved? "My husband died in prison," Sarah said, each word precise and cutting. "He died maintaining his innocence. He died while you climbed the corporate ladder on the strength of his conviction." David saw the photo on the wall again, the happy family he'd helped destroy. Saw the space heaters keeping this house barely warm. Saw the pride with which they faced each day, despite everything he'd taken from them. "I want to make things right," he said finally, knowing how inadequate the words were. "Right," Sarah laughed, a harsh sound. "Can you bring Michael back? Can you give Lucas back the years he should have had with his father? Can you erase the shame of being known as the convict's family?" Lucas stood silently, tears streaming down his face. The same face that had smiled at David through the storm, offering help without question. "The evidence," David began, "I've been reviewing it. There were things I missed or chose not to see, things that might." 8 years too late, Mr. Maxwell," Sarah cut him off. "Now please leave our home. We may be poor, but we still have our dignity." David moved toward the door, then paused. "Lucas," he said softly, "what you did last night helping a stranger in the storm, it proves your father raised you right. He would be proud." "Don't," Sarah warned. "Don't you dare speak about what Michael would feel." The last thing David saw as he left was Lucas picking up his father's briefcase, holding it close like a shield. The boy who had helped him in the storm was gone, replaced by a child forced once again to face the cruel realities of a world where good deeds don't always protect you from pain. The next morning, David sat in his office, untouched legal briefs piling up on his desk. He'd spent the night reviewing every detail of Michael Thompson's case, and what he found made him sick. Evidence that seemed circumstantial now screamed of manipulation, witness statements that contradicted each other, bank records that didn't quite add up. Mr. Maxwell, his assistant, poked her head in. "The board meeting started 10 minutes ago." "Cancel it," he said, not looking up. "Cancel everything." He made calls throughout the day, carefully, discreetly. A contractor to assess the Thompson house's repairs. A private investigator to track down old witnesses. His personal accountant to set up an anonymous trust fund. "The repairs need to look like a community program," he instructed the contractor. "Nothing flashy, nothing that draws attention." Within days, changes began appearing around Cedar Street. The city suddenly found funding to fix streetlights and repair sidewalks. A local charity started a home renovation program, with the Thompson house randomly selected as the first recipient. David watched from a distance as workers replaced their roof, installed proper heating, and fixed the ancient plumbing. He saw Lucas and Sarah's confusion turn to cautious gratitude as their neighborhood slowly transformed. But it wasn't enough. The real work happened late at night in his office, poring over financial records from 8 years ago. Someone had framed Michael Thompson. The evidence was there if you knew where to look. The charity's missing funds had been traced to offshore accounts, but the trail went cold too conveniently. Sir, his investigator called one evening. Found something interesting. The charity's director at the time, he retired 2 weeks after the conviction. Moved to the Cayman Islands. David's pen stopped moving. Get me everything on him. Everything. Meanwhile, he established an anonymous scholarship fund at Lucas's school. The boy's grades were excellent. He deserved a shot at college, at the future his father had dreamed for him. One cold morning, David spotted Lucas helping an elderly neighbor clear snow from her driveway. Despite everything, the boy's kindness remained unchanged. The sight both warmed and haunted him. Sarah continued her hospital shifts, but anonymous donations to the staff welfare fund meant she no longer needed to work doubles. He arranged it all through layers of charities and foundations, ensuring nothing could be traced back to him. But secrets have a way of surfacing. At a charity gala, David overheard 2 board members discussing Cedar Street's mysterious transformation. "Someone's pumping money into that neighborhood," one said. "The question is why?" Later that week, a junior partner dropped a file on his desk. "Thought you'd want to see this. Someone's been requesting old records from the Thompson case." David maintained his facade of indifference, but inside anxiety gnawed at him. He was playing a dangerous game. If anyone discovered his connection to the Thompsons, questions would be asked. His career, built partly on that wrongful conviction, could crumble. Yet he couldn't stop. Each small improvement in their lives felt like a step toward redemption, however inadequate. Then came the newspaper article that threatened everything. Mysterious benefactor transforms struggling neighborhood. Local residents seek answers. The photo showed Lucas and Sarah standing in front of their renovated home. Sarah's quote caught his eye: "We're grateful, but we'd like to thank whoever is behind this. Kindness shouldn't hide in shadows." That evening, David received an unexpected visit from Judge Harrison, who had presided over Michael's trial. "Interesting reading," Harrison said, dropping the newspaper on David's desk. "Very interesting location for charitable work." "Boston has many neighborhoods in need," David replied carefully. Harrison's eyes narrowed. "We both know what happened in that case, Maxwell. Some things are better left buried." The threat was clear. David waited until Harrison left before opening his safe. Inside lay copies of all the evidence he'd gathered, proof of Michael's innocence, and something more, a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Boston's legal system. As snow began falling outside his office window, David made a decision. The truth would come out regardless of the cost to him. He owed that much to Lucas, to Sarah, and to the memory of Michael Thompson. Late February brought another brutal storm to Boston. David was working late when his phone rang. A nurse from Memorial Hospital. Sarah Thompson had collapsed during her shift. Without thinking, he rushed to the hospital, only to find Lucas sitting alone in the waiting room, still in his school clothes, looking smaller than ever. "Mr. Maxwell," Lucas's voice wavered between surprise and lingering hurt. "Why are you here?" "I heard what happened," David said, sitting down carefully, leaving space between them. "How is she?" "Exhaustion," they said. "And pneumonia." Lucas twisted his father's old watch around his wrist. "She's been coughing for weeks but wouldn't stop working." The silence between them felt like a physical presence. "I've been helping old Mrs. Watson next door," Lucas finally said. Even after I found out who you were. Dad always said we shouldn't let other people's actions change who we are." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. "Your father was a wise man." "Then why didn't you believe him when he said he was innocent?" David had no answer that could justify his past actions. Instead, he asked, "Have you eaten?" Lucas shook his head. David bought him a sandwich from the cafeteria, watching as the boy tried to eat slowly despite his obvious hunger. "The neighborhood changes," Lucas said suddenly. "The repairs to our house. The scholarship letter I got last week. That was you, wasn't it?" David hesitated, then nodded. "Why?" "Guilt." At first, David admitted. "But now, I want to make things right. Your father deserved better. You and your mother deserve better." Lucas studied his half-eaten sandwich. "Mom cries at night sometimes, when she thinks I'm sleeping. She still misses him so much." A doctor appeared before David could respond. Sarah was stable but would need rest. Hospital policy stated minors couldn't stay overnight. "He can stay with me," David offered, surprising himself and Lucas. No, came a weak voice. Sarah stood in the doorway, pale but determined. "Lucas, call Mrs. Watson. You'll stay with her." Later that night, David received a text from an unknown number. "Thank you for helping my son. But this doesn't change anything, Sarah." The next few weeks brought more changes. Anonymous donations to the hospital covered Sarah's medical bills. A local diner started providing free meals to hospital staff. David worked tirelessly, gathering evidence about Michael's case while maintaining his public persona. But others had noticed his interest. Judge Harrison became a regular visitor to his office, each conversation loaded with veiled warnings. Board members questioned his distraction from major cases. Then came the breakthrough. His investigator found the former charity director living in Grand Cayman. More importantly, he found bank transfers linking him to Judge Harrison and others. David was close to unraveling everything when Lucas appeared at his office one rainy afternoon. "Your secretary let me up," Lucas explained, dripping on the expensive carpet. "I need help." He pulled out a stack of papers, college applications. "Mom's still recovering. These are due tomorrow. I didn't know who else to ask." They spent the next few hours working on the applications, the tension between them gradually easing. Lucas's essays were impressive, speaking of justice, redemption, and the power of kindness. "You know," David said as they finished, "your father wrote similar things in law school. I found his old essays while reviewing the case." Lucas looked up sharply. "You're reinvestigating?" David nodded slowly. "I think I know what really happened, but proving it, that's going to be dangerous for everyone involved." "Is that why Judge Harrison keeps coming here?" "I saw him leaving when I arrived." David stared at the boy, so observant, so much like his father. "Yes, there are people who don't want the truth to come out. But you'll keep trying? For Dad, for all of you." As Lucas left, David noticed a dark car parked across the street, its windows tinted. His phone buzzed with a text from Harrison. "Hope you're being careful. Accidents happen." That night, David made copies of all his evidence, storing them in multiple secure locations. He wrote detailed letters explaining everything, to be delivered if anything happened to him. The next morning, his office had been ransacked, but they were too late. The evidence was safe, and David Maxwell was done playing it safe. What he didn't know was that tragedy was about to strike in a way he never expected, and Lucas would once again risk everything to help someone in need. The March storm hit Boston like a hammer. David was reviewing the final pieces of evidence that would expose the conspiracy when his phone rang. Sarah Thompson's voice was barely comprehensible through her sobs. "Lucas, there's been an accident." His blood ran cold. "Where?" "Memorial Hospital. He was helping someone. A homeless man stuck in the storm. The car didn't see them." David was already running to his car. The scene replayed through witnesses' accounts. Lucas, walking home from school, had spotted an elderly homeless man struggling in the blizzard. True to his nature, he'd gone to help. As they crossed the street, a black SUV with tinted windows had appeared out of the whiteout. Lucas had pushed the old man to safety but couldn't get clear himself. The SUV had sped away. No license plate visible. No witnesses could identify the driver. David found Sarah in the emergency room, clutching her son's worn jacket. Blood stained the sleeve, the same jacket Lucas had worn the night he helped David with the flat tire. "He's in surgery," she whispered. They don't know if her voice broke. Through the window, David watched the surgical team working frantically. Lucas looked impossibly small on the operating table, surrounded by machines and urgent voices. The old man Lucas had saved sat in the waiting room, weeping quietly. He didn't even hesitate, he kept saying, just like an angel in the storm. Hours passed. Sarah alternated between silent prayer and quiet sobs. David paced, making calls, pulling every string he had. The best surgeons, specialists, whatever Lucas needed. The timing wasn't lost on him. Just yesterday, he'd notified Judge Harrison that he was reopening Michael's case. Now Lucas was fighting for his life after a hit and run. His phone buzzed a message from Harrison. Tragic accidents happen every day. Best to let sleeping dogs lie. David's hands shook with rage. They'd gone after a child. A boy whose only crime was inheriting his father's capacity for kindness. The surgery stretched into its 6th hour. Sarah had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep when the surgeon appeared, still in blood-stained scrubs. "He's stable, but critical," she explained. "Next 24 hours are crucial. The impact caused severe internal bleeding, and there's swelling in his brain." David watched through ICU glasses. Machines breathed for Lucas. Tubes and wires transformed the vibrant boy into something fragile and broken. On his bedside table, they'd placed his father's old watch. The band snapped in the impact, the face cracked but still ticking. Sarah stirred, seeing David's expression. This wasn't an accident, was it? He shook his head slowly. "They're sending a message. Because I'm close to proving Michael's innocence." "They tried to kill my boy," she whispered, rage and grief warring in her voice. "Like they killed his father. I won't let them get away with it. Not this time." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since discovering his identity. Why now, after all these years? David watched Lucas's chest rise and fall with the ventilator. "Because your son showed me kindness when I deserved none. Because 8 years ago I forgot what justice really meant. Because Michael was innocent, and it's time everyone knew the truth." The monitors suddenly screamed. Lucas's body convulsed. Medical staff rushed in as Sarah cried out, "He's crashing. Get the crash cart." David held Sarah back as they worked to restart Lucas's heart. Each second felt like an eternity. "Please," Sarah sobbed, "not my boy. Please, God, not my boy too." The sound of the flatline pierced the air. The doctors managed to stabilize Lucas, but he remained unconscious. In the quiet hours that followed, Sarah found a thick manila envelope in Lucas's backpack, addressed to her in her son's handwriting. "Mom, if anything happens to me, read this." Inside were documents Lucas had discovered in David's office during his visit, evidence not just of Michael's innocence, but of something far darker. Newspaper clippings, bank statements, and a handwritten confession from the real embezzler, all pointing to a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Boston's judicial system. "How long have you known?" Sarah's voice cut through the hospital room silence, papers trembling in her hands. David turned from the window. "Sarah, how long have you known my husband was innocent?" "I started investigating after Lucas helped me that night, but the truth he swallowed hard. I think part of me knew during the trial. I just chose not to see it." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Chose not to see it? Michael died in prison, alone, branded a thief. Lucas grew up without a father. and you chose not to see it. The evidence was manipulated. Judge Harrison and the charity director, they orchestrated everything. Michael discovered their embezzlement scheme, and they framed him to cover their tracks. And now they tried to kill my son Sarah's voice broke, because you finally decided to grow a conscience. The monitors beeped steadily as Lucas lay still, unaware of the storm breaking around him. I found this too. Sarah held up a letter in Michael's handwriting, his last letter from prison. Lucas had it in his jacket. He was going to show it to you. David took the worn paper with trembling hands. My dearest Lucas, remember what I taught you. Kindness isn't weakness, it's the greatest strength we have. Some will try to make you bitter, to turn you hard like them. Don't let them. Keep helping others. Keep believing in justice, even when it seems justice has forgotten us. Your heart is your compass. Trust it like I trust you. Love always. Dad. He wrote that 3 days before he died, Sarah said quietly, before they beat him to death in his cell for refusing to sign a confession. David sank into a chair, the weight of his guilt crushing him. Sarah, Don't you dare apologize, she cut him off. You don't have that right. Not yet. She moved to Lucas's bedside, stroking his hair. First, you're going to make this right. Not just for Michael, but for every person they've hurt. You're going to expose them all. They'll come after me. After all of us. They already have. Sarah's voice hardened. They took my husband. They tried to take my son. I have nothing left to lose. A soft knock interrupted them. A nurse entered with a detective. They'd found the SUV abandoned outside the city. The evidence inside suggested a professional hit. Of course, Sarah laughed hollowly. They're too powerful to do their own dirty work. David stood, decision made. I'm going public with everything. Tonight. A full confession, all the evidence, every name involved. They'll destroy you. Let them try. He looked at Lucas, so still in the hospital bed. Your son risked his life to save a stranger. I can risk my career to save his future. Sarah watched him for a long moment. Michael would have done the same thing. That's why they feared him. As if responding to his father's name, Lucas's fingers twitched. Both adults froze, watching as his eyelids fluttered. Lucas, Sarah whispered, hope crack in her voice. Baby, can you hear me? David stepped back, giving him space, but Lucas's weak voice stopped him. Mr. Maxwell, don't go. His eyes opened slowly. Dad would want us to finish this together. Every subscription helps us share more stories like Lucas and David's journey of redemption. If this tale of justice and humanity has touched your heart, please consider subscribing. Let's build a community that celebrates the power of storytelling together. As Lucas recovered in the hospital, David's investigation uncovered the horrific truth about Michael Thompson's final days. Through a network of prison informants and sympathetic guards, he pieced together the events that led to Michael's death. It hadn't been a simple prison accident or natural causes as reported. Michael had discovered evidence of a massive corruption scheme while working in the prison library, where he'd been assigned due to his accounting skills. He'd found irregularities in the prison's financial records that connected to the same offshore accounts involved in his original case. The corruption went deeper than anyone imagined, implicating not just Judge Harrison but several high-ranking officials in the prison system itself. 2 days before his death, Michael had managed to smuggle out a detailed letter explaining everything he'd discovered. But before the letter could reach its destination, the prison cameras mysteriously malfunctioned in the sector where Michael was housed. 4 hours of missing footage. When the cameras came back online, Michael Thompson was dead in his cell. The official report claimed natural causes, a heart attack. But David's investigation revealed witness statements that had been buried, the sounds of a struggle, muffled screams, and multiple sets of footsteps leaving the cell block. The prison doctor who signed the death certificate had received a substantial deposit in his offshore account the next day. Most devastating was the security footage David finally obtained from a hidden camera, one the conspirators hadn't known about. It showed two men entering Michael's cell late at night. Michael's voice could be heard clearly. "I won't sign a false confession. The truth matters more than my life." The sounds that followed haunted David's nights. When he finally showed Sarah the evidence, she sat in Lucas's hospital room, clutching her husband's last letter, her body shaking with silent sobs. Lucas, still weak but improving, held his mother's hand as they learned the full extent of his father's courage and the price he'd paid for it. "He could have signed their confession," Sarah whispered. "Could have come home to us." "But then he wouldn't have been the man you loved," Lucas said softly. "The man who taught me that truth matters more than anything." David stood by the window watching snow fall outside. Michael died protecting something bigger than himself. He died trying to expose a corruption that went beyond just one charity or one judge. He died a hero. The evidence was irrefutable. Michael Thompson hadn't just been innocent of the original embezzlement charges, he'd been silenced because he'd discovered a criminal enterprise that reached into every level of Boston's justice system. His death wasn't just a murder, it was an execution ordered by the very people sworn to uphold the law. As David laid out the final pieces of evidence, a nurse brought in Michael's personal effects from prison storage items that had been misplaced for 8 years. Among them was a small notebook, its pages filled with Michael's careful handwriting. It detailed names, dates, transactions, a methodical record of everything he'd uncovered. On the last page was a message to his family: "Sarah, Lucas, if you're reading this, know that every choice I made was for justice, for truth, and for you. A man can survive losing his freedom, but not his soul. Lucas, my son, never stop believing in what's right. Sarah, my love, forgive me for leaving you to fight alone." The truth had finally come to light, but at what cost? One man dead, his son nearly killed, and a system so corrupt it would murder to keep its secrets. David looked at Lucas, growing stronger each day despite everything they'd done to him. He saw Sarah, her grief fresh but her spirit unbroken, and he knew that exposing the truth wasn't enough. There had to be justice, real justice, no matter the personal cost. But even as they absorbed the horror of Michael's final moments, none of them knew that an even darker revelation awaited, one that would shake their faith in humanity itself. The confrontation came late one night in Lucas's hospital room. Sarah had just finished reading Michael's prison notebook for the third time when she suddenly turned to David, her eyes blazing with a fury that had simmered for 8 years. "You were there," she said, her voice trembling. "The day before he died. The prison logs show you visited him." She pulled out a visitor's log photocopy, her hands shaking. "You never mentioned this. Why were you there?" David's face went ash white. This was the moment he'd dreaded most, the secret he'd hoped would never surface. "They sent me to offer him a deal," he admitted, each word feeling like glass in his throat. "Sign the confession, get a reduced sentence. I was still part of their system then." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas, who had been pretending to sleep, opened his eyes, watching the scene unfold. "What did he say to you?" Sarah's question cut through the air like a blade. David couldn't meet her eyes. He said to tell his son that some things are worth more than freedom, that the truth doesn't stop being true just because people refuse to see it. His voice broke. "I walked away. The next day he was dead." Sarah's scream of rage and grief echoed through the hospital corridor. "You could have saved him. One word from you, one investigation, one moment of doubt." She advanced on him, years of pent-up anguish exploding. "You weren't just part of their system, you were their weapon." Lucas tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "Mom." "No, Lucas. He needs to hear this." Sarah's tears flowed freely now. My husband spent his last hours alive talking to the man who helped destroy him, begging for someone to believe the truth. And you just walked away." David didn't try to defend himself. "You're right. I could have stopped it all. Could have saved him. I chose not to see, not to question. His blood is on my hands as much as theirs." More Sarah whispered. "Because you knew better. You saw the good in him, and you chose to look away, just like you almost looked away from helping Lucas that night in the storm." The parallel struck David like a physical blow. Once again, he'd encountered a Thompson in need, but this time, because of Lucas's kindness, he'd made a different choice. "I can't bring Michael back," David said quietly. "But I swear to you, Sarah, on everything I hold sacred, the people who killed him will face justice, even if it costs me everything." "It already cost us everything," Sarah replied, her voice hollow. "Our lives, our happiness, our future, all sacrificed on the altar of your career and their greed." Lucas's voice, weak but clear, cut through the tension. "Dad used to say that bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." Both adults turned to him, seeing Michael's wisdom shining through his son's eyes. "He also said," Lucas continued, "that true justice isn't about revenge, it's about making things right." Sarah sank into a chair, the fight draining from her. How can anything ever be right again? David moved slowly to the window, watching the city lights blur through his tears, by telling the truth, all of it. Not just about the corruption or the murder, but about my role in it. About how I failed your husband, failed justice itself. He turned back to him. "Whatever happens next, I want the world to know who Michael Thompson really was and who I was when I helped condemn him." As dawn broke over Boston, 3 broken people sat in a hospital room, united by tragedy and the weight of truth. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the city in a blanket of white nature's attempt to make everything clean again, if only for a moment. The days following the confrontation brought a heavy silence to Lucas's hospital room. Sarah spent hours organizing Michael's prison notebooks, piecing together his final investigation like a tragic puzzle. Each page revealed not just evidence of corruption, but glimpses of the man she'd lost: his precise handwriting, his methodical mind, his unshakable moral compass. David threw himself into preparing the case, working from a makeshift office in the hospital waiting room. But late at night, when the corridors grew quiet, he found himself drawn to the prison visitor logs, reliving his last conversation with Michael Thompson. The memory haunted him. Michael, still dignified despite his prison uniform, refusing to break even when offered freedom in exchange for his silence. "Your son Michael had said that day he'll know the truth someday. Will you be able to look him in the eye and tell him you did the right thing?" Those words had troubled David's sleep for 8 years, but he'd buried them under layers of ambition and denial. Now they echoed with renewed force. Lucas, recovering slowly, watched both adults with eyes that seemed older than his years. He kept his father's cracked watch on his bedside table, its steady ticking a reminder that time moved forward, even when grief made the world stand still. Sometimes late at night he'd hold it to his ear, imagining it was his father's heartbeat, still strong, still fighting for what was right. The hospital staff began to whisper about the strange trio: the grieving widow who stood like a sentinel at her son's bedside, the powerful lawyer who looked more haunted with each passing day, and the brave young boy who somehow held them all together with his quiet strength and unwavering forgiveness. One evening, as snow fell outside the hospital windows, Lucas asked to see the visitor log from his father's last day. His fingers traced the signatures, pausing at David's name. "Dad knew, didn't he?" he asked softly. He knew what would happen if he didn't sign their confession. Sarah kissed her son's forehead, tears falling silently. "Your father believed that some things are worth dying for. Truth, justice, the example he set for you." David, standing in the shadows, finally understood the full weight of Michael Thompson's sacrifice. He hadn't just died protecting the truth, he died protecting the soul of his son, ensuring that Lucas would grow up knowing that integrity couldn't be bought or broken. The truth had cost Michael his life, nearly cost Lucas his, and forever changed them all. But as they sat together in that quiet room, surrounded by evidence of both humanity's darkness and light, they understood that the real tragedy wasn't just in what had been lost, but in how long it had taken for truth to finally break free. David Maxwell's public confession aired live on every major network, his face grim as he detailed the corruption that had claimed Michael Thompson's life. From his office at Maxwell Associates, he laid out the evidence methodically, naming names, revealing documents, and exposing a web of corruption that had ensnared Boston's justice system for decades. 8 years ago, he began, his voice steady despite the gravity of his words, "I helped convict an innocent man. Michael Thompson didn't die of natural causes in prison. He was murdered for discovering the truth about a corruption scheme that reaches the highest levels of our judicial system. Today, I'm not just confessing to my role in this travesty of justice, I'm exposing everyone involved." As he spoke, federal agents were already moving, armed with warrants based on the evidence he provided. Judge Harrison was arrested during a court session, his face ashen as they led him away in handcuffs. The former charity director was detained at Logan Airport, attempting to flee the country. One by one, the corrupt officials fell, their carefully constructed world crumbling under the weight of truth. But the price was steep. Within hours, David's law license was suspended. His partners called an emergency meeting to force him out of the firm he'd built. His accounts were frozen, his reputation shattered. Former friends and colleagues turned their backs, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. Yet for the first time in years, David felt truly free. From Lucas's hospital room, he watched the news coverage unfold, saw the shocked faces of Boston's elite as their corruption was exposed. Sarah stood beside him, her expression a complex mixture of vindication and lingering grief. The most damning evidence came from Michael's prison notebooks, detailed records of transactions, meetings, and conspiracies that had been hidden for years. Combined with David's insider knowledge and the evidence he'd gathered, it created an ironclad case that not even the most expensive lawyers could dismantle. "You'll lose everything," Sarah had warned him the night before his confession. David had smiled sadly. "I lost everything the day I chose ambition over justice. This isn't about me anymore, it's about making things right." As the story exploded across media channels, more victims of the corrupt system came forward. Other wrongful convictions, buried evidence, silenced witnesses. The scope of the conspiracy proved even larger than they'd imagined. Michael Thompson's death had finally triggered the avalanche of truth he'd died trying to expose. Lucas watched it all from his hospital bed, his father's broken watch in his hand. "Dad would be proud," he said quietly. "Not just of exposing them, but of you, Mr. Maxwell. You chose truth over everything, just like he did." The words hit David harder than any legal punishment could. In that moment, he understood that while he'd lost his career, his reputation, and his wealth, he'd gained something far more valuable: his humanity. But even as justice seemed within reach, a new threat emerged. Anonymous calls threatened his life. His car's brakes were tampered with. A clear message: some secrets were never meant to be exposed. Yet David pressed on, knowing that retreat now would make Michael's sacrifice meaningless. In perhaps the most poetic twist, it was the same corrupted system's meticulousness that proved its undoing. Every bribe had been recorded, every threat documented, every conspiracy carefully noted, all in the assumption that their power would protect them forever. Now those same records served as evidence of their crimes. As night fell over Boston, David stood at his office window one last time, watching the lights flicker across the city he'd once thought he owned. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, but for now he felt at peace. The truth was finally free, even if he wasn't. The revelation came 3 days after David's public confession, buried in a flood of documents released from sealed court records. A junior clerk, going through old case files, discovered something extraordinary: a sealed envelope, marked with Michael Thompson's prisoner number and the words, "To be opened in the event of my death, Michael Thompson." The letter had been intentionally misfiled, hidden among thousands of routine documents. But Michael, ever meticulous, had left a trail. References in his prison notebooks, seemingly random numbers, formed a filing code leading directly to its location. Even in death, he'd found a way to ensure the truth would emerge. When the envelope was finally opened in Lucas's hospital room, Sarah's hands trembled so violently that David had to help her unfold the pages. The letter, written the night before Michael's death, revealed one final, devastating truth that changed everything they thought they knew. "My dearest Sarah and Lucas," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then they've done what I expected they would. But what they don't know is that I've left evidence of everything, not just their corruption, but the real reason they needed me silenced. I discovered something far worse than embezzlement. They were using the charity to launder money for human trafficking. Judge Harrison isn't just corrupt, he's the architect of an operation that has destroyed countless lives." The room fell silent as Sarah read on. Michael had documented everything: names, dates, locations. He'd even managed to copy bank records showing millions flowing through seemingly legitimate charities into offshore accounts linked to trafficking operations. "I couldn't sign their confession," Michael wrote, "because it would have meant being complicit in their crimes. They offered me freedom in exchange for silence, but what kind of father would I be if I taught my son that comfort is worth more than conscience? Lucas, my boy, remember this. There are moments in life when we must choose between what is easy and what is right. Tonight I make that choice." David sat heavily in a chair, realization dawning. This is why they had to kill him. The embezzlement charges were just a cover. They needed him gone because he'd uncovered something that could destroy them all. The letter's final paragraphs were addressed directly to Lucas' son. "By the time you read this, you'll be older, perhaps old enough to understand why I chose truth over freedom. Know that every night in this cell, I thought of you and your mother. My only regret is not being there to watch you grow into the man I know you'll become. But remember, our legacy isn't in the years we live, but in the truths we defend and the lives we touch." As Sarah finished reading, Lucas reached for his father's watch, clutching it tight. He knew the boy whispered. He knew they would kill him, but he still chose to fight. The letter's existence was proof of both Michael's foresight and his courage. He'd created a time bomb of truth, ensuring that even his death would serve justice. The evidence he'd gathered, combined with David's confession, didn't just expose corruption, it revealed a criminal enterprise that had operated in the shadows of Boston's justice system for decades. That night, as federal agents moved to arrest more conspirators, David watched the news coverage from Lucas's room. The story had grown beyond a wrongful conviction or a murdered prisoner. It had become a revelation of systemic evil and one man's ultimate sacrifice to expose it. Sarah stood at the window, holding Michael's letter close. He died protecting not just the truth, she said softly, but all those people they would have kept hurting. My husband died a hero. Lucas, stronger now, sat up in his bed. And we're going to make sure everyone knows it. The truth had finally broken free, but its price had been paid in blood and years of suffering. Yet in that hospital room, surrounded by evidence of both humanity's darkness and its capacity for redemption, they understood that Michael Thompson's legacy would live on through the justice his sacrifice had finally made possible. Spring arrived in Boston, bringing with it not just thawing snow, but the winds of change. The federal prosecution of the trafficking ring had become the largest corruption case in the city's history. Judge Harrison and his conspirators faced life sentences, their empire of exploitation crumbling like the last patches of winter ice. David Maxwell, stripped of his law license but finally at peace with himself, had transformed his former law firm into a non-profit organization dedicated to overturning wrongful convictions. He'd named it the Michael Thompson Justice Initiative, channeling his resources and connections into fighting the system he'd once helped perpetuate. Lucas's recovery had been remarkable, not just physically but spiritually. As spring flowers pushed through the last remnants of snow, he walked the hospital corridors with increasing strength, his father's repaired watch keeping time on his wrist. The attempted hit and run had left its scars, but like his father, Lucas had emerged stronger from the crucible of adversity. The day of Michael's official exoneration arrived with cherry blossoms in full bloom. The courthouse steps, where Sarah had once wept in despair, now witnessed a different scene. Surrounded by cameras and supporters, the Attorney General formally apologized to the Thompson family, posthumously clearing Michael's name and acknowledging the profound injustice he'd endured. Sarah, standing tall in a blue dress Michael had always loved, accepted the official document of exoneration. "My husband died protecting truth and justice," she told the assembled crowd, her voice clear and strong. "Today, that truth has finally set him free." David stood in the background, watching the ceremony with mixed emotions. The investigation had revealed that his own mentor, the legendary Judge Harrison, had been grooming him to join their criminal enterprise. Michael's conviction was supposed to be David's initiation, a test of his willingness to sacrifice justice for power. His failure to question the case hadn't been just ambition, it had been an unwitting first step down a path of corruption he'd narrowly escaped. Later that evening, as sunset painted the city in shades of gold, Sarah found David in Michael's old study, now converted into a workspace for the Justice Initiative. The room was lined with case files, other potential wrongful convictions they were investigating. "Michael would approve," she said softly, surprising him. "Using your knowledge of the system to fix it. It's what he was trying to do." David turned, seeing not just forgiveness in her eyes, but understanding. "I don't deserve your kindness," he replied. "Maybe not," she acknowledged, "but Michael believed in redemption. And so does Lucas." She paused, then added, "So do I." The moment was interrupted by Lucas bounding into the room, excited about his first day back at school. He'd become something of a local hero, his story inspiring others to stand up against injustice. More importantly, he'd maintained his father's legacy of kindness, still helping others despite everything he'd endured. "Mom," he announced, "I've decided. I want to become a lawyer, but not like the old Mr. Maxwell." He glanced at David with a slight smile. "Like the new one. And like Dad, someone who fights for what's right." Sarah pulled her son close, tears shining in her eyes. "Your father would be so proud of who you've become." David watched them, this family that had lost so much yet retained their capacity for forgiveness and hope. Through Lucas's kindness on that winter night, he'd been given a second chance, not just at redemption, but at becoming the person he should have been all along. Outside, the last of winter's chill was giving way to spring's warmth. Like the changing seasons, they had all been transformed by the crucible of truth and justice. Michael Thompson's legacy lived on, not just in the institution bearing his name, but in the lives he'd touched and the changes he'd sparked. 7 years later, on a bright June morning, Lucas Thompson stood at the podium as Yale Law School's valedictorian. His father's restored watch gleamed on his wrist, and in the audience Sarah wiped proud tears, while David Maxwell, now a prominent civil rights advocate, sat beside her. Justice, Lucas began his speech, isn't just a concept in law books. It's a living, breathing thing that requires constant vigilance and courage to maintain. "My father taught me that through his sacrifice, and life taught me that through the power of forgiveness and redemption." The audience sat captivated as Lucas shared his story, not just of loss and injustice, but of the transformative power of truth and kindness. He spoke of a flat tire on a winter night, of choices that echo through years, and of the unexpected ways humanity reveals itself in both darkness and light. But it was his conclusion that stunned everyone, including his mother and David. That's why today I'm announcing the expansion of the Michael Thompson Justice Initiative. With the support of the Federal Witness Protection Program and in partnership with Mr. Maxwell, we're creating a nationwide network of safe houses and support services for witnesses brave enough to stand up against systemic corruption. The announcement drew gasps, then thunderous applause. Lucas had spent his law school years not just studying, but building on his father's legacy. The initiative would protect others who, like Michael, dared to speak truth to power. After the ceremony, Sarah hugged her son tight, whispering, "He sees you, Lucas. Your father sees everything you've become." The simple gold chain around her neck held Michael's wedding ring, a constant reminder of the love that had sparked this journey. David approached them, older now, his hair gray but his purpose clear. "Lucas, are you sure about this? Running the initiative full-time means turning down some prestigious law firm offers." Lucas smiled, adjusting his father's watch. The most expensive law firms in Boston once turned down a case because it wasn't profitable enough. That case was my father's. I want to be the lawyer who takes those cases. The three of them stood together on Yale's historic campus, each carrying a piece of Michael Thompson's legacy. Sarah had become an advocate for prison reform, turning her grief into action. David had transformed from a symbol of corruption to a warrior for justice, his legal expertise now serving those who needed it most. And Lucas? He'd become something entirely new, a fusion of his father's unwavering integrity and the hard-learned lessons of those who'd helped shape his path. His decision to expand the initiative wasn't just about honoring his father's memory, it was about creating lasting change in a system that still needed transformation. As they celebrated over dinner that evening, Lucas shared one final surprise. He pulled out an old, weathered envelope, one last letter from his father meant to be opened on his law school graduation day. Michael had somehow known, even then, that his son would follow this path. "My dearest Lucas," Sarah read aloud, her voice thick with emotion, "Today you stand where I once stood at the beginning of a legal career. But you stand there with something I never had, the knowledge of exactly what justice costs and what it's worth. Use that knowledge wisely. Change the system from within. And remember, helping others isn't just an action, it's a revolution." David raised his glass. To Michael Thompson, he said softly, "who taught us all that true justice begins with a single act of courage." To Dad, Lucas agreed, touching his father's watch. And to the future he died protecting. As night fell over New Haven, the three of them, bound by tragedy, transformed by truth, and united in purpose, looked toward that future with hope. The Michael Thompson Justice Initiative would become more than a legacy, it would become a beacon for others seeking truth and justice in a world that desperately needed both. The story that began with a flat tire on a winter night had become something greater, a testament to the enduring power of kindness, courage, and the unshakable belief that one person's commitment to truth can change the world. The end. Dear friends, if this story of justice, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between father and son has touched your heart, please take a moment to support our storytelling team. Hit that subscribe button to join our growing family, share this video with those you love, and don't forget to like. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. How did Lucas and David's journey move you? What moment touched you the most? And here's a question that's been on our minds. Would you like to hear part 2? The story of how the Michael Thompson Justice Initiative transforms America's legal system. Your support keeps these meaningful stories alive. Together we can inspire change through storytelling.